In this video, I want to talk about nostalgia. Nostalgia simply means a longing for the good times in the past. Often, these good times are associated with happy personal relationships or happy personal associations with others. For example, you can have a guy that you used to go to high school with, and he's saying, you're both now around 25, and he's saying, man, those were good times in our freshman year at high school. We should go back once to gather some good memories. What's going on? That guy is longing to good times in the past. That's nostalgia. Now, in general, nostalgia isn't bad nor good. Nostalgia is nostalgia. But you can use nostalgia for both good purposes, that is to motivate people to make new great memories in the present, but you can also use nostalgia to keep people back, to keep people in stagnation. And I want to talk about nostalgia when it goes too far. Because when nostalgia goes too far, it becomes a trap for self-destruction. Okay. I'm going to give a parable so you can understand what I'm saying here. Let's say you have two women and both came from somewhere in the state of Louisiana. And both knew each other since childhood. But they grew apart because one went to New York for her studies and the other went to Europe. Both meet online. They encounter one another. One of them asks, let's meet once to have a good time like we used to. And the other, the one who went to Europe for studies, agrees. So they meet somewhere in New Orleans and they have a great time chatting, talk about things that happened. It all appears great, right? But let's look at the bigger picture. The one that went to New York for studies, she got involved with the wrong crowd. She spent like 5 months homeless on the streets due to her drug addiction, and she's still involved with a guy who's a drug addict, but the guy manages to keep a job anyway. And she doesn't have any other friends. It's only this associate from a childhood that was willing to meet her. So now, both are there. One has the intention to keep the other hostage. The other is there just to have a good time and talk about things of the past that were great. Now the one who went to Europe for studies and who agreed to meet her is not aware of the motivation of the other. And here's the thing. That woman that went to New York for studies and then became homeless and all of that, her boyfriend is upset that this childhood associate of hers has a well-paying job while he is working at the supermarket. Well, the fact he's working at the supermarket is not the fault of the childhood associate of his girlfriend. It has to do with his own laziness. But he doesn't want to face this. So now, his girlfriend invited that childhood associate mainly because that boyfriend wanted it. Why? Because that boyfriend has plans to later blackmail that associate through his girlfriend to get money. His girlfriend's not really aware of his plan, but she senses that there's some ulterior motive, but she met with her child associate anyway. Let's call that child associate, the one went to Europe, Suzanne, and the other, Lisa. Lisa just wants to have company. Many people don't want to have her company because, well, she's in the negative. She's still kind of addicted to drugs and she's still enabling the other guy in his drug addiction, so people don't want to hang out with her. Suzanne is not aware of her drug addiction or any of that. So what's going on now? Suzanne has nostalgia. And to some extent, it didn't harm her. But now that nostalgia is used by the boyfriend of Lisa to drag Suzanne in harm's way. After a few weeks, Lisa began to ask Suzanne for money to help her out, and Suzanne wanted to help her. She had a kind heart. And little by little, Suzanne ended up taking loans on behalf of Lisa to help her out. But the money didn't went for what Lisa claimed it was. The money went to the pockets of her boyfriend, and her boyfriend later even left Lisa. But then Lisa, who complied with the theft, played the victim. It was then that Suzanne realized, hold on a minute, this Lisa is not who I thought she was. She's not that kind teenager that I knew her to be. She's changed into a malignant narcissistic manipulator. So Suzanne cut ties immediately. In this case, the nostalgia was used against Suzanne. Now look, there are times nostalgia becomes a trap because people don't want to let it go. Now I'm saying this. You can have nostalgia, but you should put it in perspective. And for some folks, nostalgia becomes their map for the future. They long how things used to be, or how they think things used to be, and they want those times to be relived again in the present. And anyone that comes by and promises them that those past good times can come back, they fall for it, without examining whether it's a desirable thing to have those, to relive those old times, or whether it's even practical. Okay. One easy example today is this whole hysteria surrounding this thing called Brexit. As an outsider from the United Kingdom, I can notice things probably many Britons don't notice. One thing that's obvious to the rest of the world is that it's now 2019. It's not the 1890s. It's not 1919. It's 2019. English has become the spoken language in the world in business and in politics. That's the leftover of the British Empire, but there is no British Empire today. Today, we have trading blocks and diplomatic blocks that have developed since the 1970s. And in Europe, it began since mid-1940s, after the end of the Second World War. So, the rest of the world sees how the world is now when it comes to economics and when it comes to diplomacy. But the Britons still have this nostalgia to their imperial past. They glorify the imperial past and they project all their unmet expectations on the imperial past. This does not count for all Britons, okay? But those that are hardcore for Brexit, that is what they're doing. They think that Britain is still that giant in world economics that could get away with almost anything because he had the biggest navy and they occupied over almost a third of Earth's landmass. Now, when you look at the situation carefully, the reason why Britain is still relevant in international politics and international economics is due to their membership to this trading bloc called the EU, which is the most successful economic trading bloc there is at the moment. Many businesses from all over the world gained access to the European Union through the United Kingdom. Many of the former Commonwealth realms, that then means the former British colonies, also gained access to the European market through Britain. But look at this, they are in the European market already, so they don't need Britain as a mediator anymore. So now that Britain leaves the EU, Britain has no say anymore in the decisions being made over there. If Britain remains in the single market or in the customs union, there'll be a rule taker, so they'll have to follow all the rules and regulations that comes from Brussels, including they need to subject to the European Court of Justice when it comes to economics. So it'll be a step backwards, and here's another thing. They'll become less relevant to the world's politics because they're not that mediated anymore to the European market. So now folks will have to go through France or to Germany. And not only that, when it comes to shipping, because despite there are airplanes today, most of trade happens by sea. When it comes to shipping, geographically speaking, Britain is an isolated group of islands from the European mainland. And the majority of the European population lives on mainland Europe. So the majority of economic activity happens there. So when cargo all over the world comes in towards Europe, it's probably going to mainland Europe. And the number one port in mainland Europe is Rotterdam. And it's from Rotterdam that shipments go to Britain. But after Britain leaves the EU, probably without a deal, what's going to happen? Rotterdam will increase in its economic relevance in the European Union, because now Britain becomes more dependent on shipments from mainland Europe. So what's happening now is that those that decided they want to leave the EU, they were influenced by propaganda, by fake news, all that. I know that, but when you look at the propaganda used by the Leave campaign in Britain, there was never any realistic plan of how Britain's future would look like after they leave the EU. There was no clear explanation of the costs and the potential hardships that they would encounter. The whole talk was that's the EU, needs us, the UK, more than we need them. Some said it would be very easy to get a deal and we would keep all the foreign businesses in here. Now what has happened? Many foreign businesses left the UK and relocated to France and Germany. And what happens now internally, the UK can't even decide how they want to leave the EU and how the relationship is going to look like. They want to leave the EU, they say, for sovereignty issues. They want to make their own rules and own regulations. First of all, they could have done that, and they did that all the time while being part of the EU, like all EU member states did. It was only when it came to trade that they had to comply, and with other minor issues, minor sectors. And even while being part of the EU, Britain often ignored EU legislation, and not only that, Britain was one of the main decision makers in the EU, so they helped construct the EU to what it is today. Alright? Now look, if the EU is this big evil dictatorship by bureaucrats that are unelected, then Britain must take responsibility for constructing it, because it was one of the main decision makers of it. But nobody talks about that. Now, I didn't want to make this video about Brexit, but I'm using it as an example here. The world of today does not operate as many of those pro-Brexiters think it is. And the fact is that the Leave campaign, they use a lot of fake news and a lot of empty promises that you can't deliver. And now that it's obvious that many of those promises can't be delivered, now some of those prominent Brexiteers are now saying to the Brexit voters, we didn't say that, or we didn't really mean that, now they want to avoid responsibility. If there was someone the Brexit should be angry at, it should be the people that lied onto them. But they're not, they're blaming it all on the EU. Why? Because they're protecting their nostalgia to the British imperial past. A past they don't share in because they were not alive back then. So now they are resisting a reality by holding on to an outcome that never existed, because that glorious great past of the British Empire never happened. The British Empire was also cruel to native white British people from the British Isles. There was exploitation both overseas and at home. So it wasn't a great, good time. And there were no trading deals made back then. The British Navy just arrived somewhere and people knew that they had to give in to Britain. That's how it went. So they're holding on to a past that never happened, and they get enraged at anyone that points it out to them. So now we have a union, the UK, that's divided. It almost seems like a failed state, and it has divided the population. Violence has emerged because of this, and no matter the outcome, they lose. If they end up forfeiting Brexit, that means the government, that many people are going to become upset, and it's going to manifest in violence, political violence. If they leave, they'll become a rule taker most likely, because even if they don't get a deal with the EU, they'll fall under the WTO. And the WTO, okay, that's true, the WTO, I pronounce it the wrong way. I pronounce it with a Dutch accent. The WTO also has rules and regulations Britain has to subject onto, and those are quite harsher. And Britain has no say whatsoever over the regulations of the WTO, while they have a big say in the regulations of the EU. So they go from being part of an economic bloc where they had big influence to being a rule taker of an international institution where they have no influence at all. But because many Brexiteers are so into this nostalgia of the imperial past, they just can't see that their own will is a trap. When the referendum was presented in 2016, folks should have asked critical questions. They should have asked, why should we want to leave the EU? Or if we want to leave the EU, how's it going to be? They should have asked critical questions, should have looked at the bigger picture. But no, folks, let me say common people in general, just want to be relieved. So when they are upset and you point out a perpetrator and you promise them that if that perpetrator leaves, things are going to become better, people likely give into it without thinking about it. And in Britain, unfortunately, that is what happened. And now they don't want to face it. The rest of the world faced it a long time ago. So the only one holding Britain back now is Britain itself. Now look, I've used this Brexit hysteria to point out what I'm teaching here. Nostalgia doesn't have to be wrong. But the moment nostalgia becomes an end in itself, that is self-destruction. And apart from this Brexit hysteria, let's leave that aside for now. Many people today are nostalgic about something good of the past, and this nostalgia is what hinders them. For example, now I will give this example anyway, because this example shows a form of nostalgia many people are conditioned into, but are not aware of it. For example, there were people that were smacked, they were physically hit by their parents. Some were even screamed at or humiliated and all of that. And in their mind, to cope with it, they disassociate it. So now as adults, when they're frustrated, they do the same thing as their parents did. Act out and look for excuses. So when they do the same thing to their children, they would say, well, my parents did that with me, but look at me, I turned out well, I'm respectful. They are projecting a past that never happened onto the situation to justify their own abusive behavior they don't want to face. And when other people are complaining that they have suffered mental anxiety as a consequence of how their parents treated them, they are reminded internally of how their parents treated them, and they don't want to face that their parents were out of line, because now they took over many of the ways of their parenthood, so they don't want to face themselves. So then they deflect by projecting a past that never happened onto the situation, saying to the individual complaining, "You're just complaining about your parents. What happened to you wasn't that bad." That's a form of nostalgia also, in which one projects a great outcome that never happened onto the situation just because there's something they want to avoid. Now, then nostalgia is self-destructive. Now, you don't have to answer this question that I'm about to ask here. But are you holding on to a past that never happened? Are you projecting a great outcome that never happened onto a situation to avoid something? This is a question I want you to ask yourself. Because if you do, then you're operating in darkness. And there is no way you can walk in the blessing while operating in darkness. It's not going to happen. Well, that's it for now. Keep agreeing with Christ and be at peace.